Greetings, all CHP listeners. You're tuned to the China History Podcast. This is Laszlo Montgomery here with a new episode. I resisted covering this topic for a really long time. The main reason was that I had my reservations about how many listeners would be interested in this subject. So when author and travel writer David Leftman started to really twist my arm recently, and I recounted the other listener requests for this topic, I decided to move ahead with it. For many of you who have no interest in botany, horticulture, gardening, plants, flowers, or trees, this episode might still satisfy your discerning tastes in China history topics. And for everyone else who is interested in the subject, if you never knew about the plant collecting that went on in China, particularly during the second half of the 19th century and into the first couple decades of the 20th century, you'll enjoy this one. The exploits of these, mostly European plant hunters, sounds a little different in 2025 than it probably did back in 1925. I only say that because in today's much different world, and with China standing as tall as it is, the idea of foreigners wandering all over whatever corners of China they could get access to, exploring and exporting all these plants, trees, and seeds out of the country, freely and with little or no government regulation or interference, hasn't aged well. Plant hunters in China during the Victorian Age have been called by some historians participators in scientific imperialism. So, keep that in mind. But don't let that diminish the story. The essence of what these men and women from all over the world did was explore the planet, look for new species of living things, study them, classify them, illustrate them, put them on display for the public, share information with colleagues, museums, and institutional gardens, write about them in scientific journals. All of that went on during this period we'll look at in this series, and it still goes on today. Going back to Shennong's time, for the thousands of years ever since, the people who lived in China pretty much scoured every acre of the country looking for any and all products of nature that could cure diseases, maintain yin and yang harmony in one's body, or enhance one's health. A lot of what I read emphasized that China's interest in the world of plants was limited to a specimen's medicinal value more than the scientific or botanical aspects. Needham vehemently denied this in Volume 6 of his Science and Civilization series and showed how the science of botany was alive and well throughout Chinese history. But the matter of plant hunters of the late Qing, the foreigners among that group, it's woven right into some of the Chinese history that we're so familiar with that happened from the Daoguang Emperor to Puyi. The life of Robert Fortune, who I featured in that Tea History series and whose books I read from in the short-lived China Vintage Hour, is the best known of this group of foreign plant hunters. We'll get to him at the end of this episode. And then in part 2 of the series, we'll look at everything that followed in the wake of Robert Fortune's years in China. In the centuries leading up to the times of the Roman and Parthian empires and the Han Dynasty, people had already begun moving around the planet, by sea and overland. Not in great numbers, but it had already started among the most adventuresome and fearless. The Silk Roads that came as a result of Han Emperor Wu's patronage in the 2nd century BC acted as an accelerant that increased the velocity of movement of people and ideas to far-flung distances. Both living and manufactured objects began making their way around the world. Grapevines, for example, were brought from Western Asia to northwest China around this time. The time it took for humans to get from point A to point B was still limited to the speed of the transport vessels of their day. And with plants being what they were and the state of seed science back then, well, it took some time for most species to spread beyond where they grew naturally. We know, going back to biblical times and from the writings of all the great ancient civilizations, people loved gardens. The Egyptian temple gardens, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the Persian paradise gardens, and all the mentions of royal gardens in China going back to the Zhou Dynasty. From royalty to the simplest farmer, People kept gardens for reasons other than to grow food. Ornamental plants were always prized, and the more exotic, the better. Ornamental plants are not used for food or medicine. They are grown for their value in enhancing the beauty of gardens, interior spaces, public landscapes, and parks. So there was always this itch to find the most beautiful and exotic species that could thrive in one's home climate. Having some flowering plant from the other side of the globe and seeing it as part of one's own garden gave endless pleasure to amateur horticulturists. And to obtain these plants from far, far away, men and women from countries everywhere in the world struck out on these very danger-fraught adventures to travel the globe and discover new species. Some did it for the sake of science, some did it for adventure and as a passion or a hobby, and others did it solely for money. I suppose even if China wasn't blessed with one of the highest biodiversity rates in the world, the European plant hunters of the late Qing would have probably still come. China was special in the world in that during the Ice Age, the Pleistocene era or epoch, the south and southeast of the country was mostly spared from the worst of the freezing cold and glaciation that covered the earth. The Tibetan Plateau, the Himalayas, the Qinling and Tian Shan mountain ranges were frozen over. But a lot of nature's bounty found within the borders of the PRC today made it through the Ice Age to about 11,500 years ago when things began to warm up a bit. You can look it up. When it comes to the richest, most biodiverse countries in the world, China's right up there with Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and the DRC. And this is especially so in Guangxi and Yunnan. So much survived the Ice Age when the world began to regenerate and spring back to life because far fewer species were wiped out by the effects of the Ice Age. At the dawn of Neolithic civilization, China was filled with a vast amount of flora and fauna. And besides this biodiversity bonanza China enjoyed, within its borders are a great number of topographies and climates. All things combined, all of China was a veritable Shangri-La to all manners of naturalists, no matter their field of study or particular interest. So it's no wonder that when the first Europeans came to China and got to see the natural wonders with their own eyes, they felt an ungovernable compulsion to study everything they came in contact with, and if possible, bring whatever they could back to their countries. It goes without saying that the first Europeans to discover China's botanical bounty were the Portuguese, Europe's first sinologists, the Jesuits chief among them. Already in the 1500s, these Jesuit missionaries were sending back to Lisbon any and all Chinese medicines that they learned of. Because the Jesuit missionaries were highly educated and learned in more subjects than Catholic doctrine and theology, they were amply qualified to do their investigative work, prospecting for plant specimens, preparing a herbarium, and transmitting the entirety of their scientific knowledge back to the Home Office. Now, I won't ruin this person's life by exposing them to an unforgiving social media world, but a friend of mine who shall remain anonymous, who, well, in anyone's estimation, is a real plantsman, a very enthusiastic hobbyist, and has his own garden and everything. Well, I asked him if he knew what a herbarium was, and he said, it's an enclosure where herbs are grown. A herbarium, or herbaria, the plural, that's a collection of plant specimens that are preserved, labeled, and systematically stored in volumes that are easy to access. You might have seen at least photographs of herbaria on many framed wall decor items in the mass market. For plant specimens, they are flattened, dried, and mounted on archival-grade paper that are meticulously labeled with the location where the specimen was found, where the plant was growing, the climate and habitat, the collector's name, and the date the specimen was collected. Then for filing and organizational purposes, a unique number was assigned to each herbarium, and there's a central catalog that lists all the herbaria in the collection. Collections of herbaria all over the world serve as libraries of dried plant specimens. Now, don't confuse them with the terrarium, which is used to contain live plants. And ever since the earliest Jesuits, going back to Ruggieri and Ricci and others who followed, they went out into nature and started gathering botanical specimens. 16th century, the know-how, it was still such that all couldn't be transported back to Portugal alive. So they would draw and describe everything they discovered. João de Castro, Viceroy of India, 1545 to 1548, did manage to send an orange tree to Lisbon. And at the end of the 1600s, in one written account, this tree was still thriving in the garden of one Count Saint Laurent. It was hard enough for a human being to survive a voyage from a European port to southern China. Plants and animals taking that journey, back then, well, their chances of getting to Europe alive were often nil. The access to China that came in the wake of Matteo Ricci's success at the court of the Wadli Emperor yielded a lot of discoveries in the plant world. The Jesuits were like a sponge, soaking up any and all knowledge of China, the people, the culture, the language, as well as descriptions of things in nature they encountered. These clerics embraced natural science as an extension of their core proselytizing duties. Because they were the most obvious choice to carry out this kind of work for the scientific community back home, they took the lead in the collection and classification of all these newly discovered botanical and biological organisms. These earliest plant explorers weren't botanists, and their descriptions or herbaria were rather amateurish and hardly scientific, but it was a start, and it indicated to those back in Europe that there were some interesting prospects out that way. With this new explosion of discoveries and untapped regions of China that had been identified but not yet explored, it resulted in a vast number of works published, but you'd really need to brush up on your Latin to read any of them. The Jesuits were able to carry out their plant collecting activities until the 1721 rights controversy that put restrictions in place that hampered their free movement in China. You remember that event in Qing history, the Dominicans and Franciscans telling the Kangxi Emperor, "My way or the highway." Yeah, the emperor schooled them in the end. And that put a damper on the preaching of Christianity in China and the plant hunting. The Jesuits of Europe took the early lead in botanical exploration in China, but as the 17th century progressed, the East India companies of the European maritime powers began to take over the lead in this endeavor. Come the 1700s, we'll begin to see the names of early pioneers in plant hunting in China. James Cunningham was among the first. In the history of plant hunting, at least, he was the first Englishman who went to China, to Xiamen first, and he then moved on to Zhoushan, where he carried out a great deal of botanical exploration throughout that watered city in Zhejiang province, just to the east of Ningbo, and he stayed in China from 1698 to 1705, still very early. Like so many who would follow in his footsteps, he was on the payroll of the British East India Company, employed as a surgeon. But Cunningham was also entrusted to carry out a fair amount of botanizing on the side. More than 600 plant specimens, mostly from Zhoushan, were collected and dispatched to London for detailed scrutiny by the leading naturalists. He was the first to see Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. As a trained botanist, he provided the first detailed descriptions of the species. And you may recall it was the Dutch royals and aristocrats who, around 1610, first popularized Chinese tea on the continent. And this is how it began. Amateurs, then trained amateurs, and finally the real deal, trained and educated botanists with an already proven track record in plant hunting. Into the 1700s and 1800s, the interest in China's plants and other natural specimens was at a fever pitch. Like many a plant hunter who came after him, in the course of carrying out his explorations, Cunningham would face life-threatening challenges and often gruesome attacks by local antagonists. One of the earliest and most important botanists, an amateur one at that, to come out of La France was Pierre Nicolas Le Charron d'Incarville, 1706 to 1657. Like most of the French naturalists, poking their noses around nature and China, d'Incarville was a Jesuit priest. He wasn't the first. He was among the first Europeans to send live plant specimens and seeds back to Europe that became the first Chinese plants to be introduced to European gardens. During this period in China, d'Incarville actually met the acquaintance of the Qianlong Emperor. The royal and the Jesuit shared this passion for gardening, and that was their bond. Ricci had the Wanli Emperor, d'Incarville had Qianlong. And thanks to this royal patronage, the Jesuits were able to freely roam in some places that otherwise would have been off limits. Qianlong allowed d'Incarville to walk the grounds of his imperial gardens. Among his most celebrated discoveries from China to the west was the pagoda tree, or Chinese scholar tree. This species always recalls the sad ending of the Ming Chongzhen Emperor in 1644, hanging himself from this species of tree in Jingshan Park. Besides the pagoda tree, French Jesuits and other travelers and naturalists sent back many specimens that ended up in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. d'Incarville was also the first Westerner to describe the kiwi fruit. It was first known as the Chinese gooseberry, or qi guo. In my lifetime, this kiwi fruit has become an icon of the great nation of New Zealand, but this gift of nature originated in China and didn't even make it to New Zealand's shores until the early 20th century. d'Incarville would go on to discover hundreds of new species among his explorations around the mountains of Beijing, as well as the lands to the north of Macau, where the Jesuits maintained their China head office. The mid-18th century saw a revolution in the world of taxonomy with the work of Carl Linnaeus and his modern system of naming organisms. This created a standard which all participators of the science used in classifying and naming the flood of new species being discovered in China. And let me just interject, in this episode, I'm only mentioning what was going on in China. Amateur and professional naturalists were all over the world doing the same thing. To jumpstart Linnaeus on his magnum opus, the Swedish East India Trading Company supplied the great man with a large number of species contained in his Species Plantarum. The Swedish were also a major presence in southern China during these early years of plant collecting. Like with the English, their plant hunters were part of the crew of a merchant vessel, and botanizing was not their main priority. With all this growth in East Asian trade, there was also a constant flow of new botanical and zoological Latin names that contained the Latin sinensis, sinica, and chinensis. Any botanist or someone familiar with those terms would know the origin of the species was in China. And not just anywhere in China. After 1755, foreign traders and those in the religion business had to limit their endeavors to southern China, around Guangzhou and Macau. The interior and all the East Coast ports, all off limits. But in 1793, thanks to one of the milestone events in Qing history, where England was concerned, there came the first botanical exploration of China's interior. And this was the one that accompanied the ill-fated Macartney mission, led by the first Earl Macartney. Sir George Staunton served as the secretary to the embassy, and his son, also named George Staunton, was also part of the group. And he later became one of the most accomplished of British sinologists and was an early teacher to the missionary and diplomat Robert Morrison. Staunton Sr. placed his son on the botanical side of the Macartney mission. Like Pierre d'Incarville, Staunton the Younger, then fluent in Mandarin, got on famously with the Qianlong Emperor when they had their moments together. Hong Kongers might know of Staunton Street, where the Soho area is today. The central mid-levels escalators run right through that street, and that's named for this younger of the two George Stauntons. Up to this time of the Macartney mission of 1793, most botanical exploration in China had been limited to Zhoushan, Ningbo, Xiamen, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Macau. After long negotiations, Britain was finally able to get the permission to send an embassy to Beijing to meet with the emperor and work out this whole trade matter. They had sailed up the coast to get to Beijing. From there, Macartney's embassy rode into the mountains to the northeast of the capital to Zhehe, today's Chengde, where the 82-year-old Qianlong was going to meet them. And on the return trip to Guangzhou, the travel logistics were going to allow for members of the sizable British delegation to sightsee through the interior of China. From Beijing to Hangzhou, they mostly traveled southward along the Grand Canal. I won't dwell on it. We've said it before more than once. The outcome of this meeting is well known. The embassy, led by George, the first Earl Macartney, didn't get what they wanted as far as more open and free trade between Britain and China. But the main mission and all that well-known politics and economics aside, there were many observations of botanical discoveries. On the trip back to Guangzhou, starting in September 1793, the plant collecting part of the mission kicked into high gear. During this return trip to Guangzhou, from Beijing south to Hangzhou, they sailed down the Grand Canal, and wherever they stopped, Staunton and others would go get a look-see at the local flora. And by November 9th, they were back in Hangzhou. Some members of the delegation headed east to Zhoushan. The rest continued on to Guangzhou overland, all the while making the most of recording all their botanical observations. And they, too, encountered Camellia sinensis bushes and documented what they observed. In 1793, tea hadn't quite yet penetrated into the mass market. That was still decades in the future. Back then, tea consumption was mostly among the aristocrats and upper classes and, as one writer put it, quote, sold in houses of public entertainment and an object of taxation to the legislature, end quote. Staunton, in vain, as things turned out, attempted to bring some plants back to Guangzhou. He and his collectors gathered about 400 new species. There were no profound discoveries, and whatever was collected, it was mostly lost to one mishap or another. As any gardener can attest, plants can be quite fragile. Again, Staunton, father and son, weren't part of the embassy for any reasons related to botany. And just because they might have known a lot didn't make them botanists. There were no Robert Fortunes or George Forrests as part of the group. Staunton Jr., as a fluent Chinese speaker, had much higher priorities than his botanical explorations. Some of the sheets from the herbaria collected on this 1793 voyage from Beijing to Guangzhou are still around, and you could see them at the British Museum, and some of them still contain Staunton's name as the collector, and Macartney's name as well can be seen. Herbaria from this expedition are also at Kew Gardens and in many private collections. Right after the British came and went, the Dutch sent an embassy to congratulate Qianlong on the occasion of his 60th year on the throne. They, too, were fortunate to trace the same route as the British in 1793, and the Dutch as well did everything they were expected to do as far as taking note of anything of interest concerning the natural world and get this data into the hands of the scientists in the Dutch Republic in its final years. The Batavian Republic and Kingdom began in 1795. Again, these attempts to explore China's botanical riches were carried out by relative amateurs compared for what was about to come in the 1800s. As we come to the 1800s, where natural sciences were concerned in general and plant collecting in specific, there was one name that keeps coming up. This was Joseph Banks. He lived 1743 to 1820 and inherited a considerable fortune in 1761. He was highly educated and devoted a good portion of his life to the pursuit of scientific knowledge. He served as a kind of role model for later persons of means and how he used his wealth to fund scientific endeavors. He wasn't a scientist or a botanist. Instead, he was a benefactor who supported many adventurous sorts who traversed the world in pursuit of new scientific discoveries. After inheriting his vast fortune, as a young man of 25, he was able to talk himself onto the HMS Endeavour, accompanying Captain James Cook on his 1768 to 1771 voyage to the South Pacific. And one of the tasks of this voyage was to view the 1769 transit of Venus across the sun on June 3rd and 4th. And the other part of the mission was to sail to the South Seas in pursuit of any terra australis incognita, or unexplored southern lands, that Britain might claim. In October 1769, the Endeavour reached New Zealand, and 6 months later, in April of 1770, the ship sailed to the east coast of Australia at Point Hicks and Botany Bay. The name of that famous body of water had been inspired by Joseph Banks. Upon reaching what was then called Stingray Bay, Cook had written, quote, "The great quantity of plants Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander found in this place occasioned my giving it the name of Botany Bay." End quote. Cape Banks, located near the mouth of Botany Bay, is named for Joseph Banks. So we remember Joseph Banks for his patronage of those who went out into the world in pursuit of scientific knowledge. He was a co-founder of the Horticultural Society and led the Royal Society for 42 years. He was the perfect person at the right time during a stretch of the Enlightenment when advances in science were happening thick and fast, with one discovery cascading into further discoveries. And through his personal relationships with other like-minded men of his time, Joseph Banks also served as a uniter, bringing together scientists from outside of Europe into a 18th and 19th century chat group where information could be shared and discussed. So he was a pioneer in the field of plant hunting. Joseph Banks was the first one to send a professional plant hunter to China, and this was William Kerr. Up to William Kerr's time at the dawn of the 19th century, when Banks sent him over to China, the hard work of scientific observation and transmitting this data back to Europe had been carried out by amateurs. They were, for their time, one of the most educated and experienced amateurs, but not trained in botany. It was clear to everyone back in Europe, and this is especially true in England, based on everything learned up till that point, China was a veritable treasure trove of new and exotic species that the gardening public would highly value. His work on behalf of Kew Gardens was restricted to Macau and Guangzhou. The mission to send Kerr to China turned out not to be the success it was hoped to be. He sent back 238 samples to Kew, and he also performed botanical explorations in Java and Luzon. And in addition to plant specimens, Kerr sent back thousands of drawings and beautiful illustrations of living plants. William Kerr died young in 1814 in Ceylon. The true details of his demise are not known for certain, but there was a report about his death which mentioned that it had been related to an opium addiction. So he was the first, or among the first, trained botanists to get a close-up look. But he wasn't the last. Into the 19th century, men and women who were trained in this sort of thing, who had degrees from prestigious institutions, or who had racked up a lot of years with Kew Gardens or the Horticultural Society of London and elsewhere, now these people were being sent to China to use their trained eyes to seek out China's natural floral bounty. After the disappointing outcome of the Macartney mission of 1793, there was another one between 1816 and 1817 with William Amherst, the first Earl Amherst. His Amherst mission, which attempted to succeed where Macartney's had failed, didn't quite make it to first base. You all surely recall this was the embassy where Amherst refused to perform a kowtow to the Qing emperor. Sir George Thomas Staunton, the son of the secretary to the Macartney embassy, acted as the chief fixer for this mission. He had tried to work out a diplomatic compromise with the Chinese side whereby Amherst would kowtow and receive the same obeisance from a mandarin of the emperor's court. The Qing court told them, in so many words, kowtow to the emperor or go stuff it. And that was the end of the 1816 Amherst mission. However, on the way back to Guangzhou, they got to make quite a few observations. Clark Abel served as the chief medical officer and naturalist for the Amherst mission, and he had been introduced by Joseph Banks. Abel was fully trained for this role and gathered quite a collection of specimens on the way to Guangzhou. Regrettably, the entirety of his work, including every specimen, herbarium, and seed, was lost at sea, one of the hazards of that time. Clark Abel, by the way, when he was in Sumatra, was among the first Westerners to get to see an orangutan. He had a very interesting life. Also from this time was John Reeves, 1774 to 1856. He grew up a poor orphan, but found his way into the tea trade early on, and this led to employment by the EIC, which led him to Guangzhou to also work in the tea business. John Reeves is remembered for his side project, which involved illustrating Chinese plants and animals, and he did his own drawings. But what Reeves is even more famous for is the work he did between 1812 and 1831, where he employed local Chinese artists to go out into the fields and mountains surrounding Guangzhou to draw any and all flora and fauna of interest. And this they did, and these illustrations, drawn by Reeves or those commissioned by him, provided naturalists with an invaluable resource, being able to see plant specimens in their living form. Someone had written of Reeves, quote, "From the time of his arrival in the country, he devoted his leisure to investigating the resources of the country and to the pursuit of various branches of science, making it his principal object to procure specimens of the natural productions and transmit them to England to such individuals or societies as appeared most likely to turn them into account." End quote. Reeves is credited with bringing the wisteria to the West. Other plants of which he was the source, directly or indirectly, were Chinese azaleas, camellias, chrysanthemums, roses, and many other species and varieties. During his time in China, he served as the chief correspondent with the Horticultural Society and kept up a vigorous letter-writing regimen with Joseph Banks. Kew Gardens became very actively involved in all the explorations going on in China. They were at or near the center of all the plant hunting that would continue in China all the way into the 1930s. Progress was being made, and horticulturists throughout Europe were quite excited about all the new plants and trees being introduced. Ensuring the survival of living plants on a voyage from China back to Europe, even in these portable greenhouses that were constructed for the deck of the ship, were fraught with dangers. For most plants, their worst enemies were the salty air of the open oceans and fungal infections. Also, the job of transporting these specimens back to Europe was often left in the hands of various East India companies, and the crew tasked with maintaining the plants and seeds didn't carry out their responsibilities the way a trained botanist might have. Herbaria remained the lone option for most all discoveries made going back to the beginning of plant hunting with the Portuguese Jesuit fathers. But as previously mentioned in the CHB History of Tea series from so long ago, when the 1829 Wardian case was gifted to the world by its creator, Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, it changed everything. His book on the growth of plants in closely glazed cases in 1842 led to a flood of European and other plant hunters to comb through the treaty ports and hinterlands of China, all in the pursuit of the most exotic ornamental plants or plants of economic value, and use these new airtight cases to bring their specimens back alive and grow them in their own gardens. And the most famous beneficiary of this invention was Robert Fortune. I thought we might close things off here by retracing his famous footsteps through Zhejiang, Anhui, and Fujian. Many of you are quite familiar with Fortune. He's come under quite a bit of criticism, particularly for being a poster child for scientific imperialism. In our litigious world, wherever intellectual property is concerned, we could look back on Fortune's work on behalf of the British East India Company as a form of intellectual piracy. There are many forceful arguments, both advocating and damning the actions of Robert Fortune, taken in China during the 1840s, but as Lou Perrin always said, he was an open-source pioneer. Fortune wasn't the first one to do what he did, going in and stealing tea plants and seeds. Back in the 15th century BC, during the New Kingdom in Egypt, Queen Hatshepsut sent 5 vessels to the land of Punt, where northwest Eritrea is today, though its exact location is still debated. That was a source for frankincense, ebony, and myrrh. To Egyptian royalty, those substances were like our critical minerals of today, so she sent out plant hunters to bring back the plants or the seeds that would allow the Egyptian royal court to grow trees inside Egypt so that they themselves could control the supply. So it was the same with tea. Up to Robert Fortune's first of 4 visits to China between 1843 and 1861, most of the past exploration had been carried out in and around Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Macau. The McCartney and Amherst missions both yielded a lot of information about plants growing in the interior of China. The same could be said of the work of Pierre d'Incarville in Beijing. But most of what was known among botanical circles and what filled up the herbaria of the Horticultural Society and Kew Gardens came from these southern locations. This was overwhelmingly so, and there was already so much just from these few locations, so it had always been a dream of botanical explorers to get a chance to explore the rest of China, farther inland from the coastal ports. With the Wardian cases and all the accumulated data that had been digested and processed up till now, Robert Fortune arrived on the scene to begin his China wanderings. He would go on to write 4 books of his travels and botanical findings. One thing to always keep in mind, although he's best remembered as the man who stole China's tea secrets and brought them to the EIC's experimental tea gardens and the foothills of the Himalayas and Saharanpur, Fortune, first and foremost, was a very educated, accomplished, and clever botanist. The early promise he showed as a young apprentice botanist in Scotland was what got him a position as superintendent of the hothouse department of the Horticultural Society. And this position, and the esteem with which his superiors at the Horticultural Society viewed him in, got him to China in 1843. All of the details are entertainingly written in the first of Robert Fortune's 4 books about his East Asian travels. Fortune was, by a landslide, the most famous botanist and plant hunter of his time. Perhaps all time, but he wasn't the only one. Once the Treaty of Nanjing pried open 5 new ports to free trade, botanists from all over the plant-collecting nations of Europe, led by Britain, the Dutch, the French, and Swedish, all were actively engaged in this enterprise. The Russians dominated the discoveries made in the north and northeast for reasons of proximity, and by no means was Robert Fortune the only game in town. Fortune left England on February 26, 1843, reached Hong Kong 130 days later on July 6th, and he spent 7 weeks there exploring the new colony, botanizing wherever he went, and on August 23rd, he sailed to Xiamen and explored all throughout that historic city. He sure had guts. That was Robert Fortune's Tidian, I guess you could say. The thing about him that made him stand out. Xiamen was a new treaty port, but that didn't mean the city of Xiamen was totally open and anyone could now roam around the surrounding areas. But Fortune? He just went out and took his chances. Obviously, he made out okay, though he did have his share of close calls. But just because a particular area was restricted or off-limits to foreigners, no matter their stripe, Robert Fortune wouldn't let that stop him. In October, he arrived in Zhoushan, the first of many trips to this watered city with a history that stretched back more than 6,000 years to the Hemudu culture of that part of Zhejiang. He got in whatever plant hunting he could in Zhoushan, Ningbo, and then end 1843, he arrived at one of his homes away from home in Shanghai. Then in January 1844, after 2 months of collecting, he sailed down to Hong Kong to wait out the winter and arranged to dispatch the fruits of his labors to the Horticultural Society. In early 1844, Fortune was back in his little corner of Zhejiang province that he had left the previous year. He based himself at Tiantong Temple, south of Ningbo. During future visits, he would return to this famous tourist attraction whenever he was exploring the tea-producing regions in and around Ningbo. After a spot of plant hunting in Manila in January 1845, Fortune found himself back in the Zhoushan, Ningbo, Shanghai region, arriving mid-March of that year. He got as far south as northern Fujian, and like he did the prior year, he'd pack up everything he had collected, both live specimens and seeds as well as herbaria, and sail down to Hong Kong. And on May 6th, 1846, after a spectacular plant hunting expedition, Robert Fortune arrived back in Hong Kong. Clearly, based on all the information Fortune had sent back over the years, the Horticultural Society knew they had picked the right person for the job. We've all heard the story. Fortune went on and wrote a book about his first trip, published in 1847, called 3 Years' Wanderings in the Northern Provinces of China. And it caught the eye of certain higher-ups at the British East India Company who gave Fortune an offer he couldn't refuse, and this led to his second plant hunting journey to China in 1848. In this trip, well documented in his second book, A Journey to the Tea Countries of China, published in 1852, he recounted his travels throughout Zhejiang, Anhui, and Fujian between 1848 and 1851. Starting in September 1848, Fortune journeyed to the most famous of the green tea districts in Anhui, taking everything in with his botanist's eye, making copious notes and illustrations, and then at the conclusion of this leg of the journey, as he did each time for all the trips he made, he would pack up everything he had been able to collect, and in November 1849, he dispatched this lot of seeds and plants to India. And then after the winter months had passed, beginning in May of 1849, he was back in China, first to the Wuyi Mountains for several months, including all the outlying parts of Fujian that bordered Jiangxi, and then after a whole summer of wandering, in November, once again, he carefully packed up everything in crates and Wardian cases, and this was forwarded on to Calcutta for transport to Saharanpur. And after another winter, in the following year of April 1850, Fortune was back in Shanghai again, this time visiting many celebrated Chinese gardens where he was able to procure many more specimens. During the summer months, he continued his field studies of tea production in the tea farms of Zhejiang, basing himself again at the Tiantong Temple on the outskirts of Ningbo. Although his observations weren't limited to the tea plant, this second trip from 1848 to 1851 was mostly about Camellia sinensis. As directed by the East India Company, his mission was to procure seeds and plants of the highest possible quality from the renowned green and black tea producing regions of Zhejiang, Anhui, and Fujian. After having performed his role in this mission, the next task was to transport the product of his efforts safely to the EIC's experimental gardens. The second trip of Fortune's wasn't solely about collecting tea plants and seeds. That was actually the easy part. Fortune also had to observe the tea farmers and masters and figure out how tea was made and what implements were used in its manufacture. And finally, he was tasked with securing Chinese tea masters to come to India under contract and show the people there all the processes involved in turning that raw tea leaf into something that was good enough to be served as a beverage. And if you recall from that History of Tea series, despite a hail of setbacks and close calls, Fortune succeeded far beyond the East India Company's wildest dreams. By the time he made it to India on his way back home to England, Fortune brought with him 2,000 young tea plants and 17,000 germinated seeds. The future prospects for India's tea industry were looking most promising. At the conclusion of this second trip, he sailed back home to Blighty in September 1851. Not long after he got himself settled, Fortune was contracted again by the EIC for another China trip, and this time he was to add more to what he had already managed to procure and to secure more tea masters to teach their skills to those at the experimental gardens in India. The third China trip was even more successful than the first two, thanks to the assistance of many like-minded naturalists who assisted Robert Fortune in the field. By the time of this 1853 expedition, the know-how of transporting live plants inside the Wardian cases had been perfected. His efforts yielded up another 23,892 tea plants and many other live specimens, and everything was sent on to India. And his third book of his travels was published in 1857. It was entitled A Residence Among the Chinese, Inland, on the coast, and at sea, being a narrative of scenes and adventures during a third visit to China from 1853 to 1856. Fortune's third visit also brought him to Taiwan for only a day, where he was able to wander around Danshui. He also got a nice, intensive, up-close look at the silk-producing region around Huzhou and Yuyao. When it was all over, Fortune sailed for Calcutta in February 1856, and by any estimation, this was another wildly successful botanical expedition in China. Everything requested by his EIC employers was delivered as promised, including more of the implements used in making tea. Fruit trees, timber, oil-yielding plants, dyes, and countless useful and ornamental plants were brought by Fortune. He left India November 9th, 1856, arriving at Southampton on December 20th, just in time for a nice, happy Christmas in the home country. By then, Robert Fortune was quite the celebrated man about town. As one last and final hurrah, in October of 1860, he sailed to China again and also spent time in Japan, plant hunting around Nagasaki and Edo, today's Tokyo. The Meiji Restoration hadn't happened yet, but Commodore Perry had already sailed his 4 ships into Tokyo Bay on July 8, 1853. Fortune collected many new species in Japan before sailing back to Shanghai in December of 1860. He got another look at Japan in the springtime and stayed into the summer months, continuing to explore all around Yokohama and other places not too distant. This journey yielded Fortune's fourth and final book, Edo and Peking, a narrative of a journey to the capitals of Japan and China. The China of Fortune's fourth trip was a much different one from when he had first come in 1843. Now, with the Second Opium War, or Anglo-Chinese War, over and the treaties signed, there were more treaty ports opened, and guys like Fortune could more easily explore parts of China that were once off-limits to plant hunters and everybody. In August 1861, Fortune finally made it to northern China, visiting Yantai, then called Zhifu, as well as to Tianjin and Beijing. Everywhere they stopped, he carried out more botanizing. When it came time to pack all his specimens up and send them back to England or India, there was no longer any need for stressing out about the survival rates. By the 1860s, the method had been perfected so that, as long as the seal of the Wardian case wasn't broken, everything contained inside always arrived in tip-top shape. After being blessed with an interesting and fascinating life, Robert Fortune died April 13th, 1880. His grave is in Brompton Cemetery, right by the West Brom tube station. Besides all the work he did with tea and in getting the Indian tea industry started, Fortune introduced Many species of camellias, roses, rhododendrons, azaleas, kumquat, and many varieties of chrysanthemums, the Wisteria sinensis, forsythias, lilacs, winter jasmine, Japanese skimmia, honeysuckle, clematis, peonies, and weigela. He also got a close-up look and documented the process of Chinese silk making, as well as rice production and Chinese horticultural practices, some of which were adopted by Western gardeners. As far as his role in expanding the level of plant diversity in Western horticulture, Robert Fortune ranks among the best. All in all, he's credited with discovering about 190 species or varieties of plants, of which 120 were entirely new to European botanists. Many live samples that had previously only been observed as part of herbarium collections were brought back. And like other plant hunters, many species were named for him, all having that species fortunae. Between Robert Fortune and so many other botanists sent to China from the major gardens of Europe and elsewhere, it led to an explosion of new plant discoveries between 1840 and 1860. And once the gardening public caught on, well, they wanted those Chinese plants for their own gardens or flower pots. There's a lot more to this story, and I think we'll slip the bookmark in here, one of the many fine bookmarks Colleen in Wisconsin sends me each Christmas time, and we'll pick up next time with more Qing-era plant hunters in part 2. Until then, this here's Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the CHP studios in Los Angeles, California, imploring you to come back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.